The cabin stood at the edge of nowhere, half sunken into the wild grass that had grown high enough to whisper against its broken walls. Its roof sagged under years of rain and wind, and the door hung loose on one rusted hinge. The valley around it was silent, save for the cry of a lone hawk circling above the dying plains. That was where he stopped, a man whose shadow looked heavier than his body. His long black hair was bound with a strip of deer leather, his chest bare and scarred from battles that no one remembered anymore. He was an Apache, the kind who had outlived his tribe, his enemies, and perhaps his own purpose. He had come to this forgotten land to die where no one would find him. Yet, when his eyes met the cabin, something inside him paused, as though the earth itself had refused to let him go quietly. He had traded a wild Mustang and a rifle for the land, a stretch of ground no white man wanted and no tribe claimed anymore. The old trader in the nearby settlement had looked at him with puzzled pity when he counted the silver coins on the counter. No one bought cabins that close to the river bend, not after the fever swept through the valley. The trader had said the last owners left behind more ghosts than memories. But the Apache didn't care about ghosts. He had carried enough of them inside his own chest. He only wanted a place to lay down his life, where the wind would bury his story and the soil would forget his name. The sun was burning low when he pushed open the creaking door. Dust swirled through the cabin like smoke from an old fire. The air smelled of wood, rot, and rain. In the corner stood a small iron stove, black with age. A broken chair leaned against the wall, and a child's wooden toy lay forgotten under it. He stood still for a long time, listening. The silence was thick, but not empty. It felt as if someone had been there not long ago. A faint trail of footprints in the dust led to the back door, smaller than his hand, light as a whisper. He followed them, expecting nothing. Yet when the wind carried a soft sound from behind the hill, a woman's cough, a child's cry, his heart gave a slow, reluctant beat. He moved through the tall grass, his steps soundless. Beyond the ridge, he saw smoke, thin, white, trembling, rising from behind a fallen tree. His instincts flared, but his soul felt strangely calm. He had faced soldiers, starvation, and the desert sun, but this moment felt heavier than all. When he reached the clearing, he saw her. A woman, pale and thin, sat near a small fire with a baby in her arms. Her dress was torn at the hem, her hair tangled, her hands trembling as she tried to warm the child. She looked up, startled, when his shadow crossed the firelight. For a moment, both froze, two lost souls caught between survival and surrender. The child whimpered, breaking the silence that held them both hostage. He didn't speak. Words had long stopped meaning much to him. Instead, he slowly lowered the knife from his belt and set it on the ground. Her eyes followed the movement, unsure whether it was mercy or warning. She clutched the baby closer. The fire crackled between them. He could see now that the child was weak, too small, too still. The woman's face was drawn, her lips cracked, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She wasn't from this land. Her clothes and the faint accent in her voice told him she came from the east, perhaps left behind when the settlers' wagons moved on. The prairie had a cruel way of swallowing the weak and the hopeful alike. He wondered how long she had been here, hiding near a cabin she didn't own, waiting for someone who would never return. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and trembling. She said she thought the cabin was abandoned. He didn't answer. The truth was, it was. At least it had been, until fate decided to cross their paths. He gestured toward the cabin, then toward her and the child, telling her without words to go there before nightfall. She hesitated, glancing at the knife he had left behind, then at his face. There was no threat in his eyes, only the kind of stillness that comes after too much loss. Slowly, she rose and carried the child toward the cabin, her steps uncertain but desperate. He followed behind like a shadow that didn't belong to her world. Inside, she laid the baby on a folded blanket and tried to start the old stove. He watched quietly, then knelt to help. His strong hands moved with surprising gentleness, arranging the wood and striking the flint. When the first spark caught, the glow touched her face, and for the first time, he saw something that stirred a memory deep within him. Years ago, He had seen that same look on another woman's face, his sister's. The night she begged him to save her newborn during the raids, he had failed then. That failure had followed him through every season since. Now, standing beside this stranger, it felt as though the earth was giving him one last chance to do something right before the end. The woman told him her husband had gone to find food weeks ago and never returned. She had stayed, hoping he would. When the baby's fever rose, she prayed for a miracle. Instead, the Apache appeared a man whose silence carried the weight of death and redemption both. She asked his name, but he shook his head. He didn't want her to know it. A name was for the living, and he had already chosen to die. All he wanted was a quiet corner of earth. But now that corner held a mother and her child's fragile lives that clung to warmth. He hadn't known he could still offer. That night, the wind howled outside and rain began to fall. He patched the holes in the roof while she rocked the baby beside the fire. He didn't understand why he cared, why he felt an old instinct waking again, the need to protect. When he glanced at her, she met his gaze with gratitude that said more than words. The storm raged, and in that storm, two broken worlds found shelter in the same ruin. For the first time in years, he didn't think about death. He thought about survival, not his own, but theirs. When dawn came, he stepped outside. The valley looked washed clean, the grass heavy with dew. The river shone like silver under the morning sun. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf cried. He looked toward the horizon, wondering if this was the land's way of testing him to see if he would walk away or stay. Inside the cabin, the baby coughed softly, and the sound pierced him deeper than any arrow. He turned back toward the door. The woman was standing there, the child pressed against her shoulder, watching him as if afraid he might vanish like all the others who had left her behind. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, his expression saying what his voice could not, that he wasn't leaving yet. But deep in his heart, he knew the peace of that morning wouldn't last. Outlaws roamed these hills, and settlers whispered about the Apache who bought land no one else dared claim. Someone would come. Someone always did. Whether it was fate, violence, or redemption waiting at the door, he couldn't tell. Yet one thing was certain. The man who had come here to die had already begun to live again. And the world would not let that happen quietly. He had never meant to stay longer than a few nights. But each sunrise seemed to hold him there a little more tightly. The woman spoke little, only when the child's fever worsened, or when she needed help with the stove or water. She moved carefully around him, like someone who had learned to survive by silence. He repaired the roof one day and mended the old fence the next, each task giving him a reason to delay the end he had come seeking. The cabin, once hollow, now had the sound of a baby's breathing, the crackle of fire, and the soft tread of bare feet moving over wooden planks. It felt strange to him, this quiet rhythm of life that didn't belong to war or wandering. Yet beneath the calm, he sensed something waiting, a storm that would come for both of them. The woman had not told him her story in full, but he learned it piece by piece, through the way her eyes darkened when she looked toward the hills, or how she flinched whenever a horse's distant call echoed across the valley. She had come west with her husband during a wave of settlers seeking land after the war. They had built the cabin together with their own hands, though the soil had never yielded much but weeds and stones. When winter came, sickness struck their small camp. Neighbors died, wagons burned, and by the time spring returned, she and her child were the only ones left. Her husband had gone hunting for food, promising to return before nightfall. That was 3 weeks before the Apache arrived. She had buried hope the way others buried their dead, shallow and unmarked. Each night, she had watched the fire fade and listened for footsteps that never came. The valley had gone silent, except for the sound of coyotes. When she first saw the Apache that day, standing by the old fence line, she had thought death had finally come in human form. But as the days passed, fear turned into a strange, uneasy trust. He spoke few words, yet there was something steady in his presence, something that made the nights less cold and the cries of her child less lonely. He spent his evenings outside, watching the horizon until darkness swallowed the plains. The air smelled of wild sage and rain. He often thought about his people, about the mountains where he was born, and the blood that stained the ground between tribes and soldiers. There had been a time when his name carried weight among warriors, when his voice could call men to fight. But those days had been devoured by loss. The land that once belonged to his ancestors was taken, his brothers scattered or gone. He had survived battles that ended in fire and betrayal. The cabin was meant to be his final shelter, the place where he could fade without leaving a trace. Yet fate had tied him to a woman and her child. As if refusing to let him disappear, sometimes at night he would hear the woman murmuring prayers. Her voice trembled, soft and fragile, asking for mercy, for protection, for her son to see another morning. He would lie awake on the floor, staring at the beams above, remembering a different prayer, one his mother had whispered before she was taken by fever. She had told him that every life he saved would bring light to his path, even if he walked in darkness. He wondered if that was what this was, a chance to earn a small piece of light, before his journey ended. But peace in the frontier was always fragile. On the third night after the storm, he found horse tracks by the riverbank, not wild mustangs, but iron-shod hooves, sharp and deep. They belonged to men who rode with rifles. He followed the tracks until the trees thinned, and there, near a burned wagon, he found a torn piece of fabric, the same kind worn by settlers. The ashes were cold, but a few prints showed that someone had been there recently. He knew what it meant. Outlaws roamed these parts, taking from anyone too weak to fight back. They had probably raided the wagon trail her husband had followed. The thought of it made his jaw tighten. He picked up the fabric, turned it in his hand, and stared toward the cabin in the distance. Something told him the woman's husband was never coming back when he returned. She was outside, hanging a blanket in the wind. Her eyes met his. Searching for answers, he couldn't speak aloud. He only said one word, "Danger." Her hands froze. She asked if it was the soldiers, but he shook his head. "Worse," he said quietly. She didn't ask again. That night, she locked the door and sat awake by the fire while he sat outside, his knife in his lap, listening to the rustle of the tall grass. The moon rose over the valley, pale and watchful. Somewhere beyond the ridge, coyotes cried, and he thought of how easily life could vanish out here. A single mistake, one loud sound, one forgotten step. Days turned into a rhythm of quiet fear. He taught her how to set snares, how to collect dry wood without drawing attention, and how to keep the fire low at night so it wouldn't be seen from afar. She listened carefully, her hands trembling only when he wasn't looking. Sometimes she asked him about his people, about the desert he came from. He would answer with short phrases in broken English, but his eyes would wander far away, as though his soul still lived under a different sky. He told her about his mother's garden by the mountain stream, about his father who rode with the warriors, about the songs his tribe used to sing to call the rain. She listened, and in those moments the line between two worlds blurred, but each morning found new signs near the woods, hoof marks, broken branches, a piece of leather tied to a bush. Someone was tracking them. He started keeping his rifle closer and told the woman not to wander beyond the fence. She obeyed, though he could see fear growing in her eyes. The baby's health began to waver again, his breath shallow and uneven. The mother prayed harder, whispering to the child that angels watched from the window. The Apache said nothing, but when she wasn't looking, he ground herbs into powder, mixed them with water, and fed it to the child with a steady hand. Slowly, color returned to the baby's cheeks. That small act changed something between them. One morning, as she handed him a cup of water, she said quietly that he was not the man she had feared. He didn't answer. Words like good or evil didn't mean much in his world. Survival was the only truth. Still, her voice lingered in his mind as he walked the hills that evening. The sun was setting, painting the sky in red and gold. He could almost hear his tribe's drums in the wind, the faint echo of a world that was gone. For the first time in years, he felt the strange ache of belonging not to a tribe or a place, but to the fragile lives he now guarded. The calm ended when he found the first sign of smoke near the ridge. It wasn't from their fire. It was black and thick, rising from beyond the trail. He crouched low and followed it until he saw movement. 3 riders, rough-looking men with long coats and old rifles circling near the valley. He could hear their laughter, harsh and careless. One of them pointed toward the direction of the cabin. The Apache felt the old fire stir in his blood again. The instincts of a warrior never die, even when the heart grows tired. He turned back through the trees, every step faster than the last. By the time he reached the cabin, night had fallen. The woman saw the look in his eyes and knew something was coming. She held her child tighter. He told her to stay inside and not to open the door, no matter what she heard. She wanted to ask where he was going, but the words caught in her throat. His silence was answer enough. As he stepped out into the dark, the wind rose again. Carrying the scent of smoke and gunpowder, he moved through the grass like a shadow, the moon glinting on the blade in his hand. His pulse was steady, his breath calm. The men were closer now, their horses restless, their laughter fading into whispers. He crouched behind a fallen log, watching their outlines move against the starlit sky. For a moment, he felt the strange pull of fate, the same fate that had led him to this place. It had placed a woman and a child in the path of his death. He had wanted solitude, but the land had given him a reason to fight again. Behind him, the cabin's window glowed faintly. He could see the woman's silhouette holding the child, her head bowed in fear. The wind rustled the grass, and the riders began to dismount. The Apache gripped the knife tighter. The night had become a silent battlefield, and in that stillness, he felt the world hold its breath. The valley that had once been a grave was now a place of choices, of what must be protected, and what must be lost. He didn't know if he would survive the night, but for the first time since his tribe's fall, he knew why he had to try. And somewhere deep inside the cabin, a baby stirred as thunder rolled over the plains, and the shadow of danger crept closer to the door. The night hung heavy over the valley, thick with the scent of smoke and rain. The Apache crouched among the tall grass, every sense alive. The riders had spread out, moving slowly toward the cabin like wolves circling prey. Their laughter was gone now, replaced by the quiet creak of saddle leather and the low murmur of voices. He could hear them arguing about the cabin, about what they'd find inside. One man said he saw smoke there days ago. Another said it must be empty. The Apache knew men like them, desperate, cruel, the kind who didn't bother asking before taking. He counted 3 horses, maybe 4, and the metallic gleam of rifles slung across their backs. He could tell by the way they moved that they weren't soldiers. These were scavengers, survivors of the lawless West, men who followed death wherever it paid. He stayed low, his breath slow, his eyes fixed on their leader. The man was tall, wearing a coat that looked too fine for the wilderness. His beard was trimmed, his hat pulled low, and his tone carried command. The Apache didn't understand every word they spoke, but he knew the rhythm of threat. These men were searching for something, maybe supplies, maybe the woman. He felt a cold weight in his chest. He had promised himself to protect her, but promises in this land were fragile things. Inside the cabin, the woman stood by the window, clutching her child. She could barely see through the fogged glass, only shadows moving against the moonlight. The baby stirred, and she pressed her hand gently against his mouth to keep him quiet. Every noise outside sent fear crawling down her spine. She wished she could help, but she didn't know how. The rifle the Apache had left near the door felt too heavy, too unfamiliar. She had watched her husband load it once, long ago, when they still believed the West would bring a new beginning. Now, it was just another reminder of everything they had lost. The Apache moved silently through the brush, circling behind the men. His bare feet made no sound against the damp earth. The memory of battle came back to him, the rush of blood, the smell of powder, the pulse that steadied when danger drew near. He didn't want to kill again, not after what it had cost him, but the past had a way of forcing old hands to remember. He crept closer until he could hear them clearly. One of the men, a younger one with a scar across his cheek, mentioned the woman with the baby who was seen near the river. The leader cursed and said they'd check the cabin, take what they could, and leave nothing behind. The Apache's jaw tightened. He waited until the first man dismounted. The horse shifted, sensing the storm in the air. The man tied the reins to a post and started toward the door. The Apache rose slowly from the shadows, his knife in hand. The wind carried a low growl from the hills, masking the soft crunch of his steps. In one motion, he was behind the man, his hand over his mouth, the blade pressed to his throat. The man froze, his breath quick and shallow. The Apache's voice came low and sharp. One word, a warning. The man nodded, trembling, and the Apache dragged him silently into the dark. When the others called out, there was no answer. The leader spat and ordered the rest to move in. The Apache watched as two of them dismounted, rifles ready. The woman saw the figures approaching from inside and backed away from the window. She looked toward the door, praying the latch would hold. The baby began to cry softly, the sound thin and frightened. She rocked him, whispering, begging him to stay quiet. The footsteps outside grew louder. Then came the sound of boots against wood. One of the men had reached the porch. The Apache moved before the first shot was fired. The silence of the valley shattered as a rifle cracked through the night. He hit the ground, rolled behind a stump, returned fire with the weapon he had taken from the man now lying motionless behind him. The leader shouted orders, the horses reared, and gunfire echoed between the trees. Inside the cabin, splinters flew from the wall as a bullet tore through the wood. The woman fell to her knees, covering the child with her body. The firelight flickered wildly, casting their shadows like ghosts on the walls. When the gunfire paused, the Apache crawled closer, using the darkness as his ally. He saw the leader crouch behind a fallen log, reloading. The others were spreading out, trying to flank him. The Apache reached for his knife again. The earth beneath his hand was slick with rain and blood. His mind was calm, focused. Every instinct he had buried since the wars returned with precision. He lunged from cover, striking fast and silent. Another man fell. The others shouted, panic breaking their formation. The leader turned, his eyes catching a glimpse of the warrior who refused to die. The chaos outside gave the woman a moment to breathe. She remembered the rifle leaning by the door. With trembling hands, she picked it up and checked the chamber the way her husband had shown her. Her heart pounded as she aimed through the crack in the window. One of the riders was climbing onto the porch, his shadow blocking the light. She squeezed the trigger, the sound deafening inside the small cabin. The man dropped, and the recoil sent her stumbling back. The baby cried again, louder now, but she didn't stop to think. She reloaded, her fingers clumsy and shaking. Outside, the Apache heard the gunfire from the cabin and realized she had fought back. A flicker of pride crossed his face, but he didn't allow himself to pause. The leader was retreating toward his horse, firing blindly into the dark. The Apache advanced, the rifle steady in his hands, but before he could close in, another shot rang out from behind. Pain burned through his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. He gritted his teeth and rolled aside as another bullet struck the dirt where his head had been. The younger man with the scar was still alive, crawling from behind a boulder, his gun shaking. The Apache forced himself to his knees and fired once. The man fell, his weapon clattering beside him. Rain began to fall again, heavy and cold. The leader mounted his horse and rode off into the darkness, leaving his dead behind. The Apache watched him disappear over the ridge, his vision blurring from pain. He pressed his hand against his wound and stumbled back toward the cabin. The woman was standing in the doorway, pale and wide-eyed, the rifle still in her grip. For a moment, neither spoke. The baby cried softly in her arms. Unaware of the silence that had followed the storm, she ran to him as he collapsed near the fence, helping him inside. His skin was burning, blood soaking through the cloth around his arm. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it to the wound, whispering that he couldn't die, not now, not after everything. He didn't answer, only closed his eyes and let her work. The fire flickered low, casting a dim light on their faces, one filled with exhaustion, the other with fear and gratitude through the night. She cared for him, cleaning the wound, feeding the fire, and praying the men wouldn't return. He drifted in and out of consciousness, seeing flashes of his past, his tribe, sister's face, the smoke of the old wars. Each time he opened his eyes, the cabin's walls came back into view, and her face would be there, steady and real. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that fate wasn't done with him yet. By morning, the valley was quiet again, but the danger had not passed. The leader would come back. Men like him didn't forgive defeat easily. The woman knew it, and so did the Apache. She stood by the window, looking toward the horizon where the trail disappeared. The sun rose slow and red, bleeding across the land like an old wound reopening. She turned to the man lying by the fire and whispered that she had seen a mark on one of the riders' coats, a mark she remembered from the day her husband vanished. Her words hit him harder than the bullet ever could. He realized the truth behind her fear. The men who came that night were not strangers to her past. Something tied her story to theirs, something darker than she had told. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was the center of a storm neither of them fully understood. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, but in his eyes burned the quiet promise that he would stand against whatever came next. Outside, the wind picked up again, bending the tall grass toward the river. In that endless sea of green, the world seemed to hold its breath once more, waiting for the next move in a fight neither of them had chosen, but both were now bound to face. The morning light crept through the cracks of the old cabin, thin and pale, touching the wooden floor like a ghost returning to familiar ground. The Apache opened his eyes slowly, his shoulder burning with pain, but his senses were sharper than ever. He could hear the fire still breathing softly, the baby stirring in its sleep, and the woman's quiet footsteps near the door. She hadn't slept at all. The night had stolen whatever peace remained in her. He could see it in the way she stood alert, trembling slightly, as if every gust of wind carried danger with it. The rifle leaned beside her, loaded and ready. Outside, the valley seemed calm, but the kind of calm that comes before something worse. He tried to sit up, and she rushed to his side, urging him to rest. He shook his head, his voice rough but steady, saying that the men would come back. She didn't argue. The look in her eyes said she already knew. She told him about the mark she had seen, the black serpent stitched on one man's coat. The same mark her husband had once mentioned before he left. It belonged to a group of outlaws that roamed the western trails, robbing wagons, burning settlements, and leaving no witnesses behind. The realization hit both of them hard. The men who had killed her husband were the same ones who had come to their door. The Apache's wound throbbed with pain, but it only fed the fire building inside him. He told her to pack what little she had and prepare to move before nightfall. She hesitated, saying the baby couldn't survive the journey through the cold and the wild. He understood the truth in her words. The world outside was no safer than the one closing in on them. He knew then that running would not save them. The fight would come here, and when it did, the cabin would either stand or burn with them inside. He spent the morning gathering what he could: tools, a handful of bullets, some rope, a hunting knife, and an old trap from behind the shed. Every step sent pain shooting through his shoulder, but he ignored it. Pain was an old companion. While he worked, the woman moved quietly around him, her fear slowly hardening into resolve. She no longer flinched at the sound of gunfire in her memory or the sight of blood on his hands. She asked what he planned to do, and he told her in simple words that they would make the land their ally. The river to the east, the hills to the west, and the thick brush near the cabin could serve as cover. He showed her how to load the rifle properly, how to aim, how to breathe before pulling the trigger. Her hands trembled at first, but by the third try they were steady. Watching her, he felt something shift deep inside him, a quiet pride mixed with dread. He didn't want her to have to fight, but in this land, innocence was a luxury no one could afford. By noon, the wind carried strange sounds from beyond the ridge-distant hooves, faint but unmistakable. The Apache froze, listening. The woman's breath caught in her throat. He told her to take the child and stay inside, no matter what she heard. She didn't protest this time. Her trust in him had grown beyond words. She closed the shutters, whispered a prayer, and held the baby close while he stepped out into the open. The valley stretched wide before him, golden under the sun, deceptively peaceful. He walked toward the old fence, the rifle slung over his back, every movement deliberate. He could feel the air changing, the quiet tension that always came before violence. He crouched near the tall grass, scanning the horizon. Then he saw them 5 riders this time, not 3. The leader was there, his black coat gleaming in the light, the serpent emblem stitched boldly on his sleeve. They were coming slow, confident, like hunters returning for the kill. The Apache watched them for a long moment, the memory of the last night burning in his chest. He knew their kind. They would not rest until the cabin was theirs and every soul inside was silenced. He returned to the cabin and told her to prepare. Her face paled, but she didn't break. She asked what would happen if they didn't survive. He said quietly that the land remembers those who fight for it. She looked at him then, her eyes glistening with something unspoken, fear, gratitude, maybe both. The baby whimpered softly, sensing the unease in the air. She hushed him gently, whispering a promise that they would see another sunrise. As the sun dipped lower, the Apache worked quickly. He set traps along the path leading to the cabin, hunter snares disguised beneath grass and branches. He filled buckets with water from the river and placed them by the door in case of fire. Every motion was precise, shaped by years of surviving worse odds. The woman helped where she could, her movements careful but determined. By the time the sky turned red, the cabin was quiet again, waiting like a wounded beast ready to defend itself. When the first rider appeared near the ridge, the Apache was already in position behind the fence. He watched as the others followed, spreading out to surround the clearing. The leader dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. His eyes swept over the land, pausing at the cabin. There was no fear in his face, only hunger. He shouted something to his men, and two of them began moving toward the house. The Apache raised the rifle, his pulse steady, and waited until they were close enough to see the worn paint on the door. Then he fired. The sound tore through the still air, echoing off the hills. One man fell instantly, the other dropped behind a log, shouting in surprise. The leader cursed, drawing his pistol, and the fight began again. Inside the cabin, the woman clutched the baby and prayed for silence. The walls shook with each shot, dust falling from the rafters. She could hear the horses screaming, the shouts of men, and the sharp crack of gunfire from both sides. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might give her away. When the baby whimpered, she pressed him close, whispering softly. Then she saw movement at the back window, a shadow slipping between the trees. Her breath caught. Another man had circled behind the cabin. She reached for the rifle the Apache had left near the stove and moved toward the back door. Her hands trembling. Outside, the Apache heard the creak of the rear boards and turned sharply. He saw the glint of steel near the cabin's back wall. The outlaw was trying to break in. Before he could aim, a shot rang out from inside the woman's shot. The sound echoed across the clearing, followed by the thud of a body hitting the ground. The Apache felt a surge of relief mixed with fear. She was learning fast, but each bullet spent was one less chance for survival. The outlaws fired back, bullets splintering the wooden posts around him. He ducked low, returning fire when he could. The pain in his shoulder burned hotter with every pull of the trigger, but he didn't stop. The leader shouted for his men to burn the cabin, and two of them broke away, running toward the shed with torches in hand. The Apache's eyes narrowed. He couldn't let them get close. He rose from cover, firing twice. One man fell, but the other reached the porch, torch blazing. The flame caught the edge of the roof, licking upward as dry wood crackled to life. Smoke began to billow, thick and dark. Inside, the woman screamed as the fire spread across the shingles. She tried to beat it back with a blanket, but the heat was too strong. The baby started to cry, choking on the smoke. The Apache charged through the open field, ignoring the bullets snapping past him. He reached the porch and tore the torch from the burning wall, throwing it into the mud. The leader fired from behind a tree, the bullet grazing the Apache's arm. He stumbled, caught himself, and aimed back. The shot hit the leader's hat, knocking it aside but missing his skull by an inch. The smell of fire mixed with gunpowder filled the air. The sky had turned gray, the wind howling through the valley. The Apache could barely see through the smoke now, but his instincts guided him. He fired again, heard the cry of another man, and then silence. The leader cursed from behind cover, calling out the woman's name. That voice froze her where she stood. Was familiar, the same tone her husband once used when he was angry. She realized then what the Apache already suspected. The man who led the outlaws was her husband, alive but twisted by greed and betrayal. The truth hit her like a storm. All this time she had waited for him, prayed for him, buried her love in his memory, only to find he had become the very danger that haunted her. She staggered back, clutching the child, tears cutting through the soot on her face. The Apache looked toward her through the haze, understanding without words. The man they fought was no stranger. This was her past, returning to finish what it had started. The leader shouted again. Stepping into the open, his pistol raised, the Apache and the woman locked eyes through the smoke. The storm had reached its peak. The next moment would decide whether the valley would know peace or burn to ash. And as the thunder rolled in the distance, both knew there was no running anymore. Only one final stand left to make. The wind roared across the valley as the final moments closed in. Smoke wrapped the cabin like a shroud, while the ground trembled with the weight of what was about to end. The Apache stood in the open, blood streaking down his arm, his breath steady despite the pain burning in his chest. Across from him, the outlaw leader, once a husband, once a dreamer, stood with his pistol drawn and eyes full of madness. Between them, years of loss and betrayal hung heavier than the clouds above. For a long moment neither man moved. The woman watched from the doorway, clutching her child as tears mixed with ash on her face. She had loved the man pointing the gun, but she knew the one standing to defend her was the one sent by fate. The leader sneered and shouted her name again, his voice cracking like dry wood. He accused her of replacing him, of hiding his son from him, of siding with a savage. His words cut through the air like broken glass. The Apache said nothing. He had learned long ago that words were useless against men like this. What mattered now was the ground they stood on, the home they had fought to protect, the child that cried inside, and the small fire that still refused to die out. The outlaw lifted his pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before the shot came, the woman screamed for him to stop. Her voice broke something in both men. She stepped out into the open, holding the baby high, the child that carried both his blood and her hope. She begged him to remember what they once dreamed, of the land they wanted to build, the family they promised to keep safe. For a second, his hand wavered. His gaze softened, and the gun lowered an inch. But greed and guilt are stubborn ghosts. He glanced at the Apache, rage flooding back into his face, and fired. The shot missed. The Apache had already moved. The echo of the gunshot rolled through the valley, followed by a blur of movement. In one swift motion, the Apache lunged forward, knocking the pistol aside and sending both of them crashing to the ground. The fight was brutal, raw, and silent, except for the grunts of effort and the thud of fists against flesh. Years of fury poured out in every strike. The outlaw fought like a man who had already lost everything. Desperate and wild, but the Apache fought with purpose, to protect, not to destroy. When it ended, the pistol lay forgotten in the mud, and the leader was still. The wind carried the last sound of the fight away, leaving only the crackle of dying flames. The woman fell to her knees beside the Apache. He was bleeding badly, his strength nearly gone. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against his wound, whispering that he had saved them, that the land owed him its peace. He looked at her quietly, his breath shallow, his gaze steady on the small child now reaching for him with tiny fingers. The moment felt endless. He lifted his hand, touching the child's cheek gently. In that simple gesture, the years of exile and sorrow that had haunted him finally began to fade. By morning, the valley was still again. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cold. The woman buried her husband at the edge of the field, beneath a tree that had withstood 100 seasons. The Apache helped her dig the grave, though his strength was failing. When the last handful of dirt was laid, she knelt beside it and whispered a prayer, not for the man he became, but for the man he once was. The Apache stood beside her in silence, understanding that forgiveness was the hardest kind of strength. Days turned into weeks. The fire-blackened cabin was repaired piece by piece. The woman worked from dawn to dusk, tending the land, mending what could be saved. The Apache stayed, though he never said why. His wound healed slowly, leaving a new scar among the many that told his story. Sometimes he would sit by the river at sunset, watching the reflection of the mountains in the water. The woman would join him, the baby in her arms, and they would watch the light fade without speaking. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It carried understanding, something deeper than words could hold. The nearby settlements began to speak of them. The widow and the Apache who guarded her land. Some called it strange, others called it wrong, but those who saw them together knew it was something sacred. They had turned an abandoned cabin into a home again. The land that had once seen only loss now echoed with the sound of laughter, of a child learning to walk, of two people who found belonging where they least expected it. One evening, as the sky burned orange and gold, the woman asked him what he would do when the seasons changed. He looked at her for a long time before answering. He said he had once come here to die, but the land had given him a reason to live. She smiled faintly, tears glimmering in her eyes. She told him the land had done the same for her. For the first time, they both understood that life wasn't about escaping the past, but learning to plant new roots in its ashes. When winter came, snow covered the hills in white silence. The Apache built a shelter beside the cabin, strong and warm. The woman would hum softly while she worked, and the child's laughter would drift through the cold air like a promise. He hunted when the food ran low, teaching her how to track in the snow, how to read the signs of the earth. In return, she taught him words he had never cared to learn, simple ones about peace, warmth, and belonging. They lived quietly, but the bond between them grew like a slow-burning fire that never needed to be spoken. Years later, when travelers passed through the valley, they would sometimes see smoke rising from a chimney near the bend of the river. They would speak of a woman and a dark-haired man who lived there with a boy strong and fearless like his father, kind-hearted like his mother. Some said the man was once a warrior who gave up his name for peace. Others said he was a ghost who found his rest not in the ground but in love. No one knew for certain, and those who visited never stayed long. The valley seemed to guard its own stories. For the woman, the years rolled on like quiet water. Her child grew tall, his laughter carrying across the fields. The Apache grew older, his steps slower, but his eyes still sharp as the day she first saw him. Sometimes she would wake at night and find him sitting outside, looking at the stars. When she asked what he saw in them, he would say they were the eyes of those who came before the warriors, the mothers. The lost children all watching to see if the living remembered how to be human. One spring morning, she found him sitting by the river, his gaze fixed on the sunrise. The air was cool, the grass wet with dew. She called to him softly, but he didn't answer. He sat still, his face calm, the light touching his features with quiet grace. She knew then that his spirit had finally found its way home. She knelt beside him, tears falling freely, and whispered that he could rest now that the land he once bought to die on had become a place of life because of him. She buried him beside the same tree where her husband's grave lay, the two resting under the same earth, but carrying different stories. The boy placed a small stone between them, carved with a simple mark of the sun. It was the Apache symbol for renewal. From that day on, whenever the wind moved through the valley, it carried with it the faint sound of his voice, steady, strong, and full of the life he left behind. The cabin remained standing through the years, its walls aged but firm. Travelers passing through the west often stopped to rest there, saying the place felt alive, as if watched over by unseen hands. They spoke of the peace that hung in the air, of how even the birds seemed to sing softer near its walls. And when the woman grew old, she would sit by the porch in the evenings, watching her son ride across the fields, the same land that once nearly took everything from her. In the end, the story of the Apache and the mother became part of the valley's legend, tale of survival, redemption, and love that defied the cruelty of the frontier. It reminded those who heard it that even in the loneliest places, life can begin again. That sometimes the souls who come to die are the ones chosen to teach the living how to endure. And when the wind swept across the plains at dusk, carrying the scent of rain and wood smoke, it felt like the land itself whispered their story back to the earth. An eternal echo of two hearts that turned an abandoned cabin into a home.